Okay, so can people see my screen?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so let me just go into full screen mode. And thank you very much for giving me the chance to share a few thoughts. Let me just hide that. Okay, so I'm very delighted to say a couple of things. I mean, I've just to make an announcement that the this workshop is partly sponsored by POID, which is this new program on innovation and diffusion, which I am director of. We just got the money about a month ago. It's a 5-year program of research funding funded by the ESRC and UKRI, which is going to be based at CP. And the aim is really to improve our understanding and suggest policies about stimulating sustainable and equitable growth, particularly around new technologies. So you know, we're going to focus on the UK, but of course this is a global problem. You know, how we get back to sustainable and equitable growth after the pandemic. It's a kind of global problem. So I think most of you will know these kind of pictures. So this is a picture of UK labour productivity, GDP per hour since 1979. The dotted line is the long-term trend, and the dark line is where we actually are. So you can see there's been this kind of dismal productivity growth, hardly any productivity growth we've had since the global financial crisis, which is one of the kind of main productivity problems that we face as a country. There's also a corollary of this is what's happened to average wages. So if you look at mean wages over the same time period, then you see this really very depressing picture where we still haven't recovered to the inflation-adjusted real wages that we had back in 2007. So, you know, these things go together, of course. So, you know, in the long run driver of wage growth has to be productivity growth. So the fact that, you know, we've had this poor productivity performance is really, I think, in my view, the main reason we've had such an awful real wage performance. And of course, the poor real wage performance drives a lot of the social political problems that we currently face in my view, as people feel justifiably very angry about not having wage growth that you know, we have enjoyed for most of the last 2 or 3 centuries. Here's a fact that is probably less well known to many of you, or some of you, which is that there is this phenomenon that we've seen in the UK and many other OECD countries, that the kind of leading firms have pulled away from the laggard firms. So you can show this in different ways. This is the OECD's preferred way. So this is the kind of productivity growth normalized in 1997 or something of the top 5% of firms in the productive distribution compared to the rest of the economy. So of course these are not the same firms over time, because which firms are the top 5% changes, of course, because there's movement. But what you can see is that the kind of firms at the top of the distribution have had pretty good productivity, whereas the firms, most of the economy has had very slow productivity growth. So another way of saying this is that the distribution of productivity, the inequality of firm performance, has expanded quite dramatically over the same time period. So you know, if you thought about, you know, wage inequality, for example, wage inequality has also increased over this time period, and this just suggests that, you know, maybe productivity dispersion has something to do with this. It also raises a series of questions. So why is it that laggard firms seem to be finding it harder to keep up with growth at the frontier? Is that because of the kind of growth of superstar firms who are very hard to emulate because they have such, you know, good performance? Is it because those firms are doing something to, you know, hold the other firms back? Is that a competition issue? Does this relate to slowing down of technological diffusion? So I think, you know, we see this not just in the UK but many other countries. But I think this is a kind of, you know, in terms of thinking about inequality and dispersion, we have to think about the firm dimension as well as the kind of worker dimension. Now, you won't be surprised to hear that I think that one of the factors underlying both the change and the level of productivity distributions as management quality. So this comes from the World Management Survey, which is this work I've been involved with now for about 18 years, starting off at the CP, where we've tried to get a measure of basic management practices around things like, collecting data at the firm, goal setting, HR practices like hiring and firing and promotion. And you can see that there's, across countries, there's a very wide variation. The kind of more high productivity countries tend to do much better than the low productivity countries. The UK is not doing too badly. We're kind of, we're not, we're not at the bottom with the Mozambiques and the Ghanas, but neither are we at the top with the kind of Japans, the Germanys, the Swedens, and the United States. So, this does suggest that there may be an issue of productivity in the UK. And also, if you look within the UK, the distribution, just as I showed you, in some sense of the kind of productivity dispersion, there's a very, very wide range of management practices. So, some firms down here, which are scoring quite badly below a level of 2, are firms which are not really keeping a good eye on what's going on in the firm in terms of the performance indicators, are setting goals which are kind of too easy or possibly hard to reach, who are not really dealing with underperformers, who are promoting people without an eye to kind of ability and talents and so on. And if you compare, say, the UK with the US, which scores very highly, it's not that the US is, every US firm is awesome and every UK firm is very poor. There's brilliant firms in the UK and there's lousy firms in the US. It's just that in the US, the whole distribution shifted to the right, and there's relatively few of these very poorly performing firms. So moving on to the question of the kind of impact of the kind of pandemic, especially on technology adoption, I think there's, I think the first order things are a lot of negative effects. So number one, there's a big fall of demand, which makes investments and all investments less profitable, and new technologies, other things. So lower demand means less investments. A second effect is, of course, you have, a financial shock. So firms who are under financial distress may not be able to make investments in new technologies and other kinds of factors just because they haven't got enough money, and that's especially true if finance is not flowing easily to the firms who need it. Thirdly, there's a pure uncertainty effect. So even conditional on those other two effects, when uncertainty goes up, the rational reaction is to kind of wait and see. So as Nick Bloom and myself and many other people have pointed out, that uncertainty creates a reluctance to do things like hiring new workers or investing in things which have a big sunk cost, like in many new technologies. And finally, there's just the kind of pure managerial distraction. So having to deal with the chaos of the pandemic means you have less time to actually maybe think about the longer run questions of how you make investments. So those are at least 4 negative effects. On the positive side, I quote unquote positive effects. You may need to adopt technology to deal with the pandemic. So what we're doing now, having online meetings over Zoom, investing in the software for remote working, those are investments that firms are making to deal with the pandemic, and you might adopt technology because that of course that's not necessarily a good thing, because you're having to spend things that you may not want to have done before. A second effect is through reallocation. So there's a lot of evidence that when you have a negative shock, you get exits and shrinking of low technology, low productivity firms, and a relative expansion of high productivity firms. I think, I'm a firm believer in the importance of reallocation, but of course, during this period, resources may not get reallocated. So people lose their jobs, they may not be able to find another job. So I think that this kind of reallocation effect, again, has somewhat has ambiguous welfare implications. If things are being reallocated to the more technologically advanced firms, we may be more relaxed. But if there's a lot of unused resources, high unemployment, then that's not obviously not such a good thing. 2 things which may be better, though, in terms of the positive effects. One is, a bad shock often forces firms to think of new ways of working, new ways of doing things they weren't doing before. And that kind of, shocking yourself out of a lethargy may, can sometimes have positive effects. And a fourth reason might be the so-called pit stop theory. So, in recessions or in bad times, you do things that cost time but save money. You do the opposite in booms. So, if you have more time because there's less demand for your products, maybe that's a time when you may reorganize your firm or may make investments in things that you didn't have time to think about before. So that's why, in fact, there's a lot of evidence that big organizational changes often happen during bad times. What evidence do we have on this? Well, there's a couple of bits of evidence from other shocks. So one shock is the China shock, which is a massive shock to firms facing greater competition. In some work I've done with Mirko Draker, we found that UK firms and European firms, in response to greater competition from China, actually adopted more information technologies and innovated more in response to that Chinese competition. So the China shock was bad for employment for those firms which were most directly affected. But for the firms who could survive, they actually tended to innovate more and adopt new technologies. And in some work with the follow-up work with Paul Romer, the Nobel laureate, we actually kind of have a kind of trap factor model, we call it, which describes that, which is a bit like this pit stop theory, that when you have spare resources, you might reallocate them to do new things that you weren't thinking of doing before. Another bit of evidence is from other recessions. So there is evidence that although R&D tends to get cut in recessions, it's kind of pro-cyclical. In the Great Depression, we actually saw many radical innovations coming in. There's a nice paper by some Bambina and other researchers at New York University, which saw that in the Great Recession, you actually saw a lot of new innovations happening. And a final bit of evidence is from the CP, actually. This is a paper in the QJ by Larkham, Ratch and Willems, who looked at tube strikes and found that commuters experimented with new ways of getting to work during tube strikes. And they actually often stuck with doing those afterwards because they just hadn't experimented with doing different things. So sometimes even adversity can actually mean that you see opportunities you weren't otherwise seeing, and those can actually persist over a longer period of time. So none of these events are none of the bad shocks are desirable by the firms who hit them, but there is a question of some of the obvious downside effects of COVID might be mitigated by innovation. So the pandemic is clearly a huge global tragedy for us and the world, and I think dealing with it management is critical both at the country level and the firm level. But there are many impressive examples of innovation which we've seen during the pandemic. Many firms changing their products and services quickly. We've seen new vaccines coming on at lightning speed, which shows what could be achieved when the public and private sector work together. The theory is often ambiguous, so we need new systematic evidence like the CBI and CP survey, which we're going to talk about. My personal sense is that the pandemic has accelerated many existing trends. So like moving towards online activity and remote working, trends which are happening already, but when everybody has to move together, we can coordinate almost in a new equilibrium. So my view is that we'll never fully return to how we worked before, but we will we'll make some fundamental changes, both in technologies and ways of working that we wouldn't have done without the pandemic. Okay, so thanks very much.
Thank you, John. I'll just share my screen. Can you see that properly? Full presentation mode? Great. Okay, so as John said, I'd like to share our project work, which was joint work with the CBI. It was a business survey on technology adoption, and this is work with Capucine Rion, who's on the call. And we're really grateful to the collaboration with the CBI and Al Pesh, who's also on the call, and Andrew Thompson for working together to develop the survey, and Juliana Oliveira Cunha, who provided excellent research assistance. This work was all funded by one of the ESRC's rapid response to COVID-19 grants. In terms of our motivation, we wanted to provide timely research on the business response to the crisis and to therefore help inform policy as it evolves in this very fast-paced environment. Our focus is on process innovations that might have been induced by the crisis in the first few months after the first national lockdowns were imposed. So we're basically looking at the period from March till the end of March to the end of July, as opposed to longer-term innovative activities that firms might undertake, like R&D expenditure or patenting. So more specifically, we asked about the adoption of technologies and management practices which, based on the literature and the CBI's work and others, McKinsey, Be the Business, are considered productivity enhancing in normal times. So for example, digital technologies, digital capabilities, and management practices, and we gave some examples here in the survey so the respondents knew what we were talking about. We also had some questions just to find out whether firms had introduced new products and services in response to the crisis. And in terms of a preview of what we found that there was large-scale adoption of new technologies and practices amongst the firms, and these businesses expected to persist with these innovations beyond the immediate crisis. So our survey was sent out by the CBI. We called it Supporting the Business Response to COVID-19. It was conducted in the last 2 weeks of July, and we have a second survey planned next year. So we're really keen to hear people's thoughts of interesting angles to explore. The recruitment was via email sent by the CBI to its survey panel, which, as I understand it, includes members and non-members, and it was also promoted on social media, so it was theoretically open to any business, although, as in other projects, we didn't get very many sign-ups through that method. We organised our questions into 4 sections. So we have basic information, including company registration number, sector, size, regions of operation. We asked 2 pre-COVID questions, which we thought might be useful. One is, had the businesses adopted any new technologies or technological capabilities in the 3 years prior to the pandemic? And 2, the share of the workforce that could work from home in pre-pandemic times. We then asked a series of questions consistent with other regular CBI surveys to understand the response to COVID-19 in terms of business disruption, adjustments to operations, impacts on turnover and employees, and the government support schemes accessed. Then our main questions were on process innovation, and to make it user-friendly, we had the same structure of questions for the 3 types of innovation that I outlined before, and we asked questions basically, have you adopted? What influenced the adoption? What have been the impacts so far? What are your intentions for the future? And then we delved a bit more deeply into the barriers around adoption, on the process innovations, and the types of government policy that would be considered useful. And then a slightly smaller section on product innovation, where we just found out, whether this innovation had happened, its drivers, etc., and again, the types of policy that would be useful. So just to briefly look at the sample, we managed to achieve 375 firms. They were spread across regions and sectors of the UK. So they were 15% in London, 29% in manufacturing, and this map kind of shows the share of respondents across NUTS 2 regions. Our respondents did tend to be larger and older than the typical UK firms, so more established. Half were small in employment terms, so under 50 employees. But because of this larger, on average, sample, we do consider heterogeneity by different size bands and other business characteristics in our analysis. As found in other surveys, these businesses had obviously faced large-scale disruption, with many of them having to close business sites, over 80% experiencing reduction in turnover with an average loss of nearly a quarter, and the furlough scheme was the most popular government support. So accordingly, they'd made very large adjustments to their operations, with many of them transitioning to remote working, partially or in full, and some had already made redundancies, so about a quarter of them. However, they were actually very optimistic on survival, so only 1% of the sample considered that it's unlikely they'll be in business by the end of January 2021. In terms of our results, we found that most firms have innovated in response to the pandemic. So over 60% had introduced new digital technologies or management practices, slightly less on digital capabilities, and nearly 50% had introduced new products or services. And when we think about other surveys that tell us, is this larger than we might have expected in normal times, or say following the financial crisis, other previous surveys, including the UK Innovation Survey and the Workplace Employment Relations Study, which was conducted last in 2011, suggests that what we see here represents quite high rates, given this is a 3.5-month period compared to these surveys, which were 2-3-year periods. Most of the businesses said that COVID-19 prompted or accelerated the adoption, so you can see that in the second chart. The dark blue shows the share that said it prompted, and the light blue accelerated. So that kind of supports what John said, that he feels this was accelerating things that were already happening, perhaps. In terms of non-adopters, a third of those planned to adopt new digital technologies or capabilities in the near future, and a fifth planned to adopt new management practices. Overall, the firms expected these innovations to outlive the crisis. So across all the types of innovation we consider, over 90% expect to continue with it beyond the crisis. And we also asked about what were the impacts on profitability so far, and what they might expect the impacts on the workforce going forwards would be. And these were both overwhelmingly positive. So most firms considered this would be positive impact on profitability. And over time, they expect that this will either make employees more productive or allow them to reallocate employees to other tasks as opposed to having less need for employees. When we looked at heterogeneity in terms of these patterns, As we would expect and as consistent with other surveys, we found that larger businesses were more likely to innovate across all 4 categories. And on the right here, we have a simple regression where we're looking at the probability of these different adoptions or innovations. And we found that actually something that's very important here is the pre-COVID adoption, which I suppose we might have expected, which is why we asked it. So it seems that if you've already got that absorptive capacity or that experience, it's easier to accelerate and do what you were doing already because you realize the value of it and you know how to do it. On digital technologies, we also find that the share that work from home already is a predictor, and also in London. So it seems London firms were much better at introducing digital technologies, but there isn't a clear regional pattern for the other types of innovation. Looking at the barriers, and again consistent with other surveys, we found in this current context, clearly macro uncertainty, COVID-19 and Brexit are a major factor, and they were the most reported factor. I wish we'd asked about the relative importance of each of those. That would have been an interesting thing, and maybe we can explore that in the next survey. But financing, reorganization costs, and skills were all important, and this is really consistent with what you see in the barriers for broader innovators, so not just process innovation in the UK Innovation Survey, and also in our separate Business Basics Fund project, AI for SMEs, where we're just focusing in on London's retail and hospitality sector and AI technologies, and amazingly, these same constraints are coming out of the top. In terms of the government assistance schemes, accordingly, I guess given these barriers, we see that tax incentives are the most popular amongst large and smaller businesses, and then grants particularly popular for smaller businesses. Just quickly, because I don't have much time, on the product service innovation, we also found that tax incentives and grants were popular. And this is where actually in the economics literature, there's more evidence in terms of John and others have done work to show that R&D tax credits work. So the UK Innovation Survey as well mentions here that the credits are an important factor. So perhaps it can be explored whether this type of mechanism can be encouraged for technology adoption as well. In terms of conclusions and next steps, we see that COVID-19 appears to have accelerated certain types of innovation in a way that previous crises might not have done. This could be due to the nature of this crisis that enforced large-scale change very quickly, but also perhaps the readiness of relevant technologies. I mean, I guess many of us can identify the fact that maybe we were using remote meetings a bit, so we already knew how to use them, and then we accelerated that as opposed to this being a completely new thing that was untested and unproven. Our results highlight a number of important questions that we want to investigate in our follow-up survey and in other research using secondary data sets. Firstly, are these innovations going to persist? Will they have positive impacts on firm performance and survival, as the businesses in our survey expect? Will they lead to higher productivity of existing workers and firm growth, and therefore increased employment, or actually a reduction in employees over time? And will this vary by type of innovation, or type of technology, or by firm size or sector? Does this represent a one-off change, or businesses moving on to a more innovative trajectory where they'll actually continue to introduce new technologies over time? And finally, in the context of policies, will we find that firms that have taken up financial support schemes actually fare better in terms of surviving through adapting and making these types of investments and ultimately their productivity? And thanks very much. I'll hand over to Tara.
Thanks very much, Anna. Really excellent presentations by both you and John. Give us a really good backdrop to the discussion that I'm going to share with you. I'm just going to find a way to share my screen here. Hopefully it works now. Can you all see my screen? Great. And basically, I was going to share with you kind of 2 different sets of findings. One is just some broader observations on technology adoption, which builds on our kind of broader work with Be the Business, but also with McKinsey Global Institute. And then specifics on the analysis we did for Be the Business this summer around especially the kind of user journey in adopting. And I guess what's unique about that is we looked quite hard at the supply side of the equation as well. So not just why do firms not adopt, but also why are there not the right products and services available for firms to adopt. And I'll share some of that with you in a minute. Just the starting point observation, of course, is around productivity. Technology adoption could be an enormous boost to productivity growth, and we desperately need that here in the UK and I guess elsewhere. And just to give you some idea of the order of magnitude, across different sectors, we're looking at anywhere between 20 to 60% improvement in productivity if already currently existing technology was used to automate all the tasks that can be automated. So this doesn't even require any new technological innovation to take place. Of course, that's not technical potential is not the same as adoption, but in our kind of mid-case scenario pre-COVID, we expected something like a 1.5% productivity boost potentially in the kind of mid-case scenario across the whole economy per year, if that kind of adoption of AI technology went ahead. Now, obviously, things have happened since, and I was always a bit of a skeptic in terms of the speed of adoption, just because of the enormous barriers we see across various different sectors and various different businesses. And it's also quite hard to say whether UK businesses are worse on tech adoption than other countries. There's not a lot of fantastically good data on this available, but the best data that I've come across is from the DESI survey at the EU level. And what it suggests is the UK is kind of middling. So we're not anywhere close to sort of the Denmarks and the other Scandinavian countries or the Netherlands, but also we're not like massively worse than Germany and France in terms of tech adoption. But still, 40% of all UK businesses are very low adopters of digital technology. So that doesn't put us in a great place in terms of either current productivity, or as you know, our analysis also suggests that future productivity, the ability to adopt, actually depends on current adoption, especially around skills and competencies and confidence around how businesses think about productivity. Now, if you break these figures down, and I don't suggest you try and read any of the small print on this page, the point of it is that adoption among large businesses is very significantly higher than among medium and small businesses across all kinds of technologies, whether we're talking about cloud, we're talking about cybersecurity, or we're talking about online sales, or we're talking about, you know, using technology to automate your HR functions. These are all massively higher in large businesses. So our project with Be the Business, therefore focused more on the medium and small end and medium and small sized businesses in order to fully understand what's stopping a lot of these businesses from adopting. And so we looked at two different kind of sources of information for this. One, we did a fairly robust and very detailed survey of, you know, whether people were adopting, what they were adopting, or, you know, why they were adopting it or not adopting it, and so on, with a few questions around COVID, but mostly focusing on the kind of longer term fundamentals of reasons to adopt or not adopt certain types of technology. And then we, in parallel, did a very interesting piece of ethnographic research. So essentially observing the adoption journey of a number of small to medium-sized businesses, seeing how they struggled with finding the solutions, seeing how they struggled with implementation, seeing how they struggled with, you know, choosing between providers, et cetera, et cetera. And that gave us a lot of insight into how not off the shelf these products still are for a lot of small businesses. And in many ways, one of the key conclusions from this analysis is that in terms of adoption, small businesses are much more like consumers. It has to be plug and play. It has to be easy and quick because they don't have the bandwidth essentially, or indeed the resources or the expertise like large businesses do to invest in something very complex that requires a complicated set of tech, but also people and change management capabilities. Now, the somewhat good news is that most of these people, when we ask them, the businesses in our survey, say that they do think technology is really important for their business, profitability, their performance, their productivity, all those things in the future. But there was this really drastic drop off with the micro businesses. 63% of micro businesses in the UK, and that's businesses with less than 10 people, think they already have all the technology they're going to need, which sounds like incredible. And so clearly there's kind of further segmentation and sort of understanding of those businesses to be delved into. They are quite a large chunk of the UK economy, but also probably the hardest one to try and address. Our focus, because of Be the Businesses focus, was more on the small and medium-sized businesses, so people who employ more than 10 people. And when you dig deeper into all of that data, then, you know, there's quite a lot of positive signs there. People are saying they're definitely planning to invest more in technology post-COVID. And they are kind of thinking about it in many different ways. But when you then ask those businesses who haven't already invested or haven't already adopted, you do come up with a long list of barriers, which is not dissimilar to what we already heard from Anna. But it's really quite important to remind ourselves, you know, at the top of the concerns that people have are just like people issues. When you implement new technology, you don't just implement new technology. You need to change the way people work. You typically, ideally, would redesign the entire process in order to get the most of that technology. And that's not something that a lot of smaller business managers have confidence around, that kind of people management, change management. Around technology, especially. Quite a lot of complacency in terms of people thinking, well, you know, we're just doing fine, which raises some questions around kind of competition and exposure to competition, but never mind. But quite a lot of the barriers have to do with what they're actually being offered in terms of solutions in the marketplace for small and medium-sized players. You know, small and medium-sized businesses just don't think there are the solutions that, for them, the costs are outweighed by the benefits. And this, of course, you know, prompted us to also look at the supply side in some depth to understand, well, first of all, is this true that there aren't these solutions? Or is it just a matter of kind of search costs and finding them? Or is it something about the marketing or the, you know, the pricing structures or whatever about these solutions that is not fit for purpose for small and medium-sized businesses? But also, like, why aren't there those solutions? A competitive market surely should produce some solutions for even the small and medium-sized market. And I'll say a bit more about that on my last page. But in starting with the sort of supply side picture, this is a scan of about 1,000 different solutions that are out there for medium and small businesses. And the red dots are where we didn't find anything particularly tailored. And yet in the kind of adoption journey work with the SMEs, they were very much looking for something that spoke to them. And even if it wasn't specifically tailored as a product, at least the marketing message was that this is something you as a retailer can benefit from, or this is something that your, you know, nail salon will definitely benefit from, or your construction company or whatever. So a lot of SMEs were expecting somewhat more tailored messaging and marketing, but also they were expecting tailored products. And there were a lot of kind of specific use cases. All of the columns here are, you know, different use cases across different parts of the business. So we got into quite a lot of detail around what specific technology adoption products might be out there that could help. And the, you know, vertical axis is more about the, you know, whether there were specific sector-specific solutions. And of course, in many places you don't, in some places you don't need sector-specific solutions, like in HR probably, or finance or accounting. But in many places you do, like if you know, you're using CRM or, you know, customer solutions, or indeed selling online, etc. A lot of that will benefit from being sector specific. And so there was clearly some evidence that, you know, there isn't necessarily the supply as much as there isn't demand. So obviously the two interact. The other thing that was clear was that the actual adoption journey was incredibly painful. So this chart shows you kind of the degree to which people found different aspects of different steps of the adoption journey painful / challenging. So you see that the axis actually only starts at 5 and 10 would have been super challenging. And there, you know, everything here is quite challenging. So 30% of businesses said everything is pretty challenging. What's interesting is also the difference between the black line and the blue line. So black line were people who said they had been successful in adoption, and those people actually say it was more challenging. So you could theoretically assume that that means they had to put more effort into making this adoption successful, which again is not anywhere near the sort of idea of plug and play or making adoption easier for businesses which don't necessarily have all that capacity to think about these issues. And migration, which is the thing in the middle, sort of popped out also as a critical issue, which on the supply side is something that businesses could definitely improve on. So I won't talk through the left-hand side of this page because we've sort of captured already what the key barriers to adoption are on the demand side from businesses' perspective. They see many and various problems, starting from the fact that they don't necessarily see the cost benefits stacking up or the pricing models don't work for them. We did then try and finally get a bit of an idea of, well, why is it that there isn't the supply? And there are pockets of supply and some new competitors emerging, which may eventually take over. But certainly the larger players, they're just not accustomed to serving this segment, and their economics don't really work for this segment. You know, the customers are too small. You know, the margins they can make are too low, and you know, dealing with any sort of customer service activity with this volume of customers wouldn't really match what they've got in the current operating model. There are ways in which they can adopt that operating model, get much more customer centric, make communities of users be their service mostly, which a lot of software products do now. But there's a long way to kind of close that gap between supply and demand. I'll leave it there and look forward to the discussion. Thanks.